Welcome everybody to this Trail Ambassador virtual event here with Friends of the Inyo about some of the great work we were doing in Death Valley this fall. Before we jump in, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping issues and kind of optimize how you can see both the presentation and our presenting speakers this evening. If you go to the top right corner of your screen, there should be a little view button and you can pick how you want to see things, either standard or side-by-side speaker or side-by-side gallery. I would recommend side-by-side speaker because then that'll just highlight myself, Lindsay, and Matt. And Matt just got his beard worked on today in Las Vegas. So you're going to want to see that in all its glory and full detail. So I recommend going into that side-by-side speaker view. And then we are going to be recording this evening, but again, that'll just be me, myself, Lindsay, and Matt.
Yeah.
All four of us here.
A lot of Alex.
And the great presentation we have for you. So that way you'll be able to take a view if you want on YouTube. So with that said, I think that covers our housekeeping issues, and I will kick us off and present Lindsay Butcher and Matt Ferlicchi, who are joining us this evening. And like I said, Friends of the Inyo Trail Ambassadors, our stewardship program. We were really lucky to head out into the wilds of Death Valley this fall and winter for 8 weeks of great work, doing some off-road track effacement and restoration. So Lindsay is going to be our guide this evening. So take it away, Lindsay.
Why, thank you. And thank you everybody for joining us for this event. This was some really fun, challenging, good work to be involved in, and I'm happy that you guys are all interested in it. So yeah, I am Lindsay Butcher. I was this past season's trail ambassador for Friends of the Inyo, and myself along with Matt were the only two people who were there for the entirety of the weeks of work that were done there. So we're the experts. Not really. And with that, I will pass it on to you, Matt.
Hi, everybody. I'm Matt Ferlichi. I am contracted through the Great Basin Institute. It's a nonprofit organization that works with Death Valley National Park to hire for positions that they can't hire through it as Park Service positions. And it's been great working with the Great Basin Institute. I started with Death Valley and Great Basin in 2017. Doing paleontology. I interned as a paleontologist. That rolled into some further work with, again, with Great Basin, and furthering some of the research that that my discoveries as intern had led to. That sort of rolled into, that was kind of finite, that funding. And so when that funding ended, there was an opportunity to do some off-road recording of some of the disturbances in the park. And so I rolled into that position, and that's gotten me here where I am now as OHV restoration lead to help try to solve this problem of illegal off-road driving in our national park.
Nice. So this is a map showing Death Valley and the major roads, the paved roads that are there, but also what they call backcountry roads, where you are totally allowed to drive on the dirt, but those are designated roads. And people are confused and think that you can just off-road into the sunset in Death Valley. And it is kind of misleading. There are a bunch of like Jeep rentals all around Death Valley, and I can totally see how people get confused with that kind of messaging. But up in the right-hand corner, totally appropriate. You can drive there. Down in the lower right-hand corner, don't suggest it. you have to get towed out of that situation, and it's very, very expensive. And Matt, if you want to kind of talk on the towing and the fines and whatnot, you.
Sure. Yeah. Well, what I would say is that there are off-road disturbances, illegal tracks in the park that can look like dirt roads. And so their persistence in the landscape can be misleading for people who don't necessarily know what is a road or what isn't a road. You know, there's also some confusion with the language of off-roading. So off-roading means driving off the pavement, not necessarily driving, especially in Death Valley, it means driving on dirt roads, not driving off of roads completely. And so some of that confusing language can lead to these issues as well. Yeah, a tow, if your vehicle gets stuck in the landscape, is quite expensive coming out of Pahrump, the nearest town. Thousands of dollars just to get your vehicle removed. And most of those are rentals that you're not supposed to be taking off-road anyway, so you can get yourself in some trouble. And as far as fines, you can be fined a minimum of $750 for off-road driving. And then if it is worse, it can lead to a case against you, and you could be paying for the entire restoration of that disturbance. So quite expensive. We hope you don't do it.
And Matt, we did get a quick question about that differentiation between what constitutes a road versus a designated route of travel. And if you could just touch on that real quick.
So yeah, so we have over 1,000 miles of paved and dirt road in the park. We don't currently have signage for every single dirt road. So there may be a dirt road that is on the map, but doesn't potentially have a sign for it. And it can look like an illegal disturbance, but actually the other way around. An illegal disturbance of somebody driving off-road illegally, if that disturbance is left to sit in the landscape for a persistent amount of time, people might confuse that for a dirt road and think that it's an okay place to drive when it isn't. And so you can have repeated disturbances, incursions in that same area.
Cool. And that leads to a good question, or a good thing to note, folks. Another housekeeping issue I forgot. If you do have any questions at any point during the presentation, go ahead and put them in the chat. We may answer them in the moment if it seems like a good segue, or we'll have a Q&A at the end. So, but we'll definitely get to your questions. So thanks to David for that one.
So here is a perfect example of one of those disturbances that eventually kind of just turned into a dirt road that shouldn't be there. It's not legal to be driving down, but this is at the Devil's Cornfield, and where I've circled with my cursor is a scar across the landscape where people have driven off-road straight through the Devil's Cornfield trying to get out to some dunes. And enough people have done that over time, and there hasn't been any kind of treatment applied to disguise it, that I even, the first time we drove by it, thought, oh, look, there's a dirt road. We could go down that way, which is not the case at all. If anybody, Matt or Alex, you want to talk on that?
Yeah, one of the main issues with these would be known as a frequent disturbance, and it is an issue where you see a disturbance on the landscape that invites future disturbances. You know, repeated fences in the same area that compact the soil to the point where you basically have a road in the landscape that is not it is not a road, but it basically essentially becomes a road. This is a point of concern because it's directly at a wayside. So we direct visitors to this parking area and to a wayside of the Devil's Cornfield to explain the landscape to them. And there's a illegal frequent disturbance directly in front of them, becomes an invitation to do this behavior, to see this behavior in the landscape and think that it is it is okay, or if it's not okay, it's maybe not that big of a deal because it persists. And so this one is a one of high concern for that reason.
Yeah, and invisible from space, as we're seeing here. So, we'll see a lot
This
of
one's on-
photos coming up.
This one's
where,
on Google.
Yeah, this one's on Google Earth. We'll see a lot of stuff that we see from the wayside, as people are driving by. But this one, you can only imagine what it looks like in reality if, where the satellites are picking it up, orbiting the Earth. So.
Yeah. And so this is kind of demonstrating how sensitive the environment is and how destructive the tracks really can be. These are all the salt flats that we were working on and different textures of the salt flats. But you can see up in the upper middle, someone was just walking around barefoot, and even just someone's body weight is preserved in the playa for who knows how many years, and how long it takes the land to reclaim that and kind of heal over that scar. So it's easy to see how one car going out creating one track could be highly detrimental, and then more cars doing that just leads to total devastation of an entire area. I don't know if you guys want to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I would add that the footprints are not ideal, but it is legal in the park to walk off trail. We don't have a lot of actual trails in the park, designated trails. You're free to roam the wilderness and the landscape. But doing that can lead to preserved, fossilized, as we see footprints in the landscape. And when you're driving off road, and we're thinking about how heavy that vehicle is, a 1-ton vehicle driving on a surface that doesn't get that sort of compaction, you can imagine that how persistent that disturbance could be in the landscape for decades. It takes a long time for the surface to recover, for the soil crusts to recover, these salt crusts here. The evaporative processes require water. They require precipitation events. Death Valley gets 2.5 inches of precipitation a year. It's one of the driest places in the country. And so you don't get a lot of water to help naturally efface some of these disturbances. So if they're on the landscape, they will stay. And we'll walk through our work to try to speed up that natural effacement process. But it is important to point out that once someone has driven off-road, it's nearly impossible to make that area whole again and make it perfect. The effacement processes we work on are not necessarily intended to get it back to 100% normal. It's just to help lessen that visual scar on the landscape and help move that natural effacement process along.
So here are kind of perfect examples of what that visual scar is. On the right-hand side is just a close-up. You can see the tire tread and everything, but those tracks get so incised because underneath that salt crust is usually loamy or clay kind of soil. And so you end up with these really high contrast shadows that are really noticeable from the side of the road. And so eventually we figured out that we could use the shadows to our advantage. Not quite at first.
Don't give away the whole story there, Lindsay.
Well, it's a bit of foreshadowing.
Yeah. I'm a storyteller. I don't know. If you guys wanted to speak on severe tracks.
I just wanted to bring up a question that was brought up that was pretty good. Matt, you mentioned that it is okay to walk on the playa. Is it because there's no official trail when they're in those scenarios, is it best for folks to kind of spread out when they're walking across or follow each other in like a single file, or what's the best kind of practice for that?
I would say if there has been any precipitation and that the salt crust can vary in cases that Lindsay can attest to. We've had to do some restoration, some very hard salt crust that you can take a sledgehammer to and not be able to bust it up. If you're walking on that, you're not going to necessarily cause any issues, right? You're not going to leave any imprints that are going to be long lasting. If the ground is soft, I would stay off of it. I would recommend that we stay off of it if we're trying to preserve the natural landscape as best as possible. But it is one of the reasons people come to Death Valley is for these salt playas, to experience this area and get a chance to kind of walk around and look at it and interact with the crusts, right? And that is not illegal to do. It's just something that we would maybe be mindful of staying off of. Especially with your vehicle, would be best. I would prefer you walk on the landscape if we're going to have to choose there. But yeah, I think just being mindful that your tracks can last a long time. And we have issues too with people who want to write their name in the salt crusts as well, which is kind of unnecessary these days. I think you could take a photo with your phone and then just kind of scribble your name on the picture if you wanted to. It would be a lot safer for our natural resources than in our national parks.
Absolutely.
I know that our teams were conscious of not taking the same route forward and backward all the time at our work sites. We were trying to not scuff that up as much as possible. So I imagine if you are going to walk out there, treat it kind of like walking through a meadow where you're more dispersed and not going to be incising social trails all the way out there.
That's right. And that Lindsay brings up a good point for restoration and folks who might want to reach out to volunteer. Having a large volunteer group out doing restoration is not necessarily helpful. It may be more impactful to the landscape. So we are mindful to limit our numbers, limit our time out there, try not to have repeated trips back and forth to the vehicles if necessary, if we can avoid it. Yeah, I think you touched on all that.
So these are some examples of kind of a monkey see, monkey do copycat attitude where one person originally drove off into the playa and then someone else decided, hey, look, someone else did it. Let's go do that too. And you just end up with these spaghetti piles of tracks that are crisscrossing all over the place for miles and miles. Just to show kind of how much it happens.
Yeah, so less of a frequent disturbance here on any specific trackway, but more an area that's just been, damaged repeatedly because of either the presence of existing tracks that invites people to drive off-road, and also the topography itself. Then the accessibility to some of these areas. They're flat areas. They look like an easy place to drive your vehicle. You see it in commercials. You want to do a little adventuring, and you spend a few minutes on the surface, and it lasts for decades. So,
yeah. So these are just some GIS layers that we have of all of the recorded tracks, most of which we actually touched on and restored significant portions of, but you can see people just going out there throwing loop-de-loos out in the playa, going for little roadside joyrides.
Yeah, so this is a lot of the recordings of tracks from 2017 to recent, with the work of Amber Laird, our OHV tech in the park, and Mark Gatlin, another OHV tech, both with Great Basin Institute. We also have law enforcement in the park that records some tracks. My experience started in 2018 in the summer, so I was out in 120 plus degrees recording some of these tracks, and it was uncomfortable, both to deal with the hydration issues, and also just to see the damage. My first year doing this was there was no restoration in sight. I was told we're not focusing on that. We're just going to try to record the damage as best we can so we can get a sense of where our hot spots are in the park to identify for restoration. But it very, very extensive. 100 miles recorded this year, this 2020, 100 miles of road of OHV disturbance. Over 100 the year before, and then close to 100 in 2018. So it's quite a problem. And I'd add too that any one of these disturbances is not an invitation just locally to drive off road, but it sends the message that this is something that is allowed in the park, something that is not necessarily a priority because it does exist. We have a lot of signage in the park that says driving off road is prohibited, driving off designated roads prohibited. I would liken this in some sense as an example. A lot of people probably have friends with dogs or are friends with dogs, where you might have gone hiking or on a trail or to a park where you see, a notice that says keep all dogs on leashes, 6 foot leashes. And frequently we see people without dogs without leashes to a large degree, and it's mostly okay. There aren't many issues with it. If you were to take that approach here, you might see the signs that say driving off road is prohibited, but if you see the disturbances, you might think that maybe it's not that big of a deal. Maybe it's just a posting that's legal, a legal posting that needs to be up there, but it doesn't really matter. It's a real issue, and they persist on the landscape for a very long time. It takes a short time to do them, and they last a really long time. And so it's very much a problem in the park, as you can see from these maps.
Yeah. Matt, we got a couple questions. I can tell that this one on the right here is in that bad water basin that we're working on, but where are the other 2 photos tracks from? This
So
one's
the top
off of
left
West Side Road.
map is West Side Road to the north. That runs along Death Valley proper, the west side of Death Valley, and that's the first few miles of that road. It's a salt playa area that is repeatedly hit. To the bottom left is the Mesquite Dunes area and Devil's Cornfield area. So that image we had shown previously of that frequent disturbance, I believe, is up on that top, just to the top right there.
And what's the difference between the different colors?
So the purple tracks are from 2017 and 2020. We recently archived our latest layer and our 2020 layer. So the red disturbances are the newest tracks from 2021.
And the green.
And then the green lines are our restored areas. So that's the work that we had done from October to December along Badwater Road. It's important to point out here that we don't have approval to do restoration on all the areas in the park for the reasons of the federal processes that are required for getting approval for doing any of this ground disturbance work in the park. And so we focused on the areas where we did have approval, which was Badwater Road, as well. You can see that we have done work there and not elsewhere on these maps.
Yeah. And then we had a question about how these are recorded, if they were recorded by drones. It's all ground ops going out with a GPS locator and walking along these routes. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. We walk all of these tracks with a tablet and either an external or internal GPS. It's really as simple as that. It's driving the road and monitoring, and then seeing the new disturbance, walking it in full if we can. Some of these go out for miles, and it's an issue when it gets a little too warm in the park, which is often. it's pretty hot out there, and at times we don't necessarily get to record the entire disturbance. For restoration purposes, we focus on the visible distance of the disturbance, or the visible extent from the road of these disturbances. So that's somewhere near 1,000, 1,500 feet off the road. But it's important to record the entirety of these disturbances, so we have a true sense of the distance that's impacting the landscape.
Yeah. Someone brought up a good question about the racetrack, and I can just touch on that, whether we've worked on the racetrack. Before we started working with Matt a couple years ago, I want to say in 2018, around February, we had a volunteer group go out to the racetrack with Death Valley NPS folks, and did a day of some work out at the racetrack. And so we're hopeful to do some in the future with the crew. And then Matt, do you want to? We have some questions about how often how hard is or easy is it to apprehend the people that are doing this, and how often does that happen, and what do the fines look like?
So I can't answer directly on the frequency of our disturbances that we have caught people doing it, as opposed to just recording the damage. Mm-hmm. But it's happening with more frequency. That law enforcement will see an individual off-road. If you think about the process of this, somebody is, if you look at West Side Road here at the top left, it's somebody driving down the road who just pops off, does a donut, pops back on the road, and keeps going. Those are really hard to catch. You have to be in the right spot to witness it, and then apprehend that person. If somebody is driving off-road illegally and they are seen doing it by law enforcement, the law enforcement has to make that decision of how severe that disturbance is at that time, and whether it's a mandatory appearance would be required to further to create a case and go after restitution charges to try to replace the costs of that damage, or to provide a citation for a dollar amount, which I think is $750 at the moment, and I might be wrong on that figure, as a one-time citation for off-road driving in the park.
Yeah, thanks.
In a case like racetrack, we had a civil suit for somebody who drove 19 miles off on the racetrack. And that resulted in a big settlement for the park. That funding is to be used for the restoration of the racetrack. And that is potentially some work down the road that Death Valley and Friends of Inyo plan to cooperate on and have them back out in the park for some more restoration.
Yeah.
Do you know ballpark value what that suit was?
Cost or
Mm-hmm.
the settlement? Mm-hmm. I think I'm allowed to state that. I think it was $50,000 around there
for 19 miles of joyride. Cool.
It's an expensive drive.
Yeah, really damaging.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. Well, I think let's keep it going. There we go. Nice.
Sorry.
No, it's everybody has so many questions, but I think we'll just hold on to those till the end and see where we get. Thanks, folks.
Yeah. So as we've established, it's a huge problem, and aside from being recorded and documented, there wasn't much actual physical work being put into the restoration until recently. So here is our colorful list of characters that we got to use in our work. On the right hand side, you can see most of the tools that utilized, Matt has a fancy name for almost every single one of them. And then you can see just kind of some examples of how we were using those tools out in the field. Matt, do you want to list off some names that we had?
So you may be looking in the top left, there's a broad fork that we had two of them, and the first one I had named Matthew Broad Fork. So naming these tools can get quite clever, as you might notice. It was really a fun way to just kind of feel like we're making some progress in the restoration realm. Seeking approval for restoration in the process, and naming the tools kind of made it a little fun. Keep morale high in the field. I think Alex named the one of the broad forks, right?
Yeah, we called it Vlad the Impaler because, you know, me being the safety nut that I am for our work, I kept getting afraid and having these nightmares of someone like, because those big, you know, things, you take them down with two hands and they're pretty big, and I kept, you know, reinforcing that we have to wear proper sturdy footwear, so that way, because I kept seeing one of those things going through someone's foot, and so we named it Vlad the Impaler. Was the name of that apparatus. Yeah, but yeah, lots of fun tools out there.
Yeah, so that broad fork is that's an aerator, and it's intended that those long tines, steel tines, you stab into the earth to help aerate the soil. We were using those for decompaction, to aerate and also to decompact, and they actually worked really well for uplifting the crust, as our techniques sort of improved through time. The garden weasel, the little red guy, we named him Tiny Dancer, and those little tines there, or I named him Tiny Dancer. And those helped to pulverize the soil clods that we'll probably see upcoming in the next few slides.
Mm-hmm.
The McCloud rake as well was a useful tool as well for busting up the soil clumps and the salt crusts. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So these are kind of a quick depiction of our first techniques that eventually we kind of abandoned. More foreshadowing for you. But so if you think back to one of the first slides of how incised those tracks are, you end up with a really raised kind of gutter of the track and a highly compacted inside. And so we were breaking down that gutter to kind of try to backfill the track a little bit, and then coming through with Vlad the Impaler and aerating, because the idea was that we would water it and the water would saturate down and then kind of be the impetus to salt crust formation. But didn't quite work out that way. So here we have breaking up those gutters, filling in the incision, using Tiny Dancer to bust up those big clots of clay and salt and incorporate everything in together, kind of make it more homogeneous. And then we went through and watered everything. And here we are doing some of that. Matt with impeccable watering technique. Don't wield a McCloud like Tess is up in this picture. You'll hurt
Showing
your
us what
back.
not to do there. Yeah. Yeah. So these methods was an attempt to restore this surface and these compacted trackways. And it was time consuming, the process that we had gone through with this, to pulverize those trackways specifically and break up those soil clods and pulverize them, and then break everything out evenly, and then water the surface with the hope that in time that salt crust surface is going to reestablish itself. Ultimately, what we came to find out that the visual visual aspect of our restoration was that we made the track much more visible as a result of our work. And so while it may in time, and these will take a long time before the restoration processes show some results, in the short term, it wasn't an effective way of dissuading further disturbances in that area.
I do have to argue that the lower right-hand picture looks better than just a untouched track to me. We've got a lot of salt crystal formation from probably overwatering, but maybe we expedited the reclamation process by Mother Nature. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think one thing you'll see, you know, as I think Matt and Lindsay are alluding to is, you know, one thing that's interesting to, or really important to remind ourselves is, this is a very unique place. No one's done this work before. There's, you know, in a lot of the work that we do, there's trail manuals on how best to take care of a trail in the Sierra or wherever you go. But, you know, Matt and Lindsay and the rest of the crew were really kind of building the boat as they're sailing it, but in the most positive way possible, right? And that it really did take just a lot of like, okay, let's think about how we can do this, but you know, not being married to any singular way of doing it. And I'll foreshadow a little here as we go on. Their techniques really got just so refined and so much better as they kept going. And so, you know, I would say to Matt, I think it was maybe like more visible for like a week or so, but even, you know, when I would go back a week later, it was less visible. And then you guys got to a point where the before and afters are just outstanding as we get going. But yeah, I think it's really interesting and unique in this work that it took a lot of teamwork from the crew of like coming together and reevaluating, okay, what's working, what's not, what are some ideas on how we can do that. And so Matt, you know, kudos to him for being a great leader and really listening to Lindsay and the Friends of the Inyo crew, so that way everyone's input was coming in and they were getting great stuff done, in spite of the fact that this is really groundbreaking, pun intended, work. So.
I want to add too that this work that we're looking at now, it was what, 110 degrees out at the time. Yeah. This was not necessarily ideal. It was October, but it was warm for October in Death Valley. And we had some time constraints with our grant funding of needing to get some restoration work done. And so Alex and Lindsay and everyone at Friends of Inyo, the whole crew that came along each week, which changed from week to week at times, you know, did a great job of being there. Was pretty awesome. So as far as teamwork, just having a commitment to doing some manual labor in some very hot climate was impressive. So
yeah,
I don't know that comes off here. I think people should have their heaters on in their front of their computers to get the sense.
One horsefly just circling their head.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right.
They bite.
Good horseflies.
God.
they sure do.
But so, with all of our foreshadowing, we're starting to get into our progress here. We, with a lot of collaboration and kind of just checking in with everybody in our techniques, we figured out that we couldn't make the tracks go back to 100% original. And that shouldn't be the goal. Our goal instead should be to disguise the track and make it so that people aren't invited to further go out there. And so we started kind of messing up the area in between the two tracks, because if you, on the right-hand side, you can see it still looks like a track. Even though we've kind of applied some techniques there, you can see two very definite side-by-side lines, versus on the left-hand side here, we started to kind of take a more organic shape with the track line and disturbing a higher volume of area, but better disguising the track, which ultimately was a better result, I'd say.
Yeah, and I would point out this came about from Lindsay's work on our previous track, that the section closest to the road didn't require the type of breaking up of clods and pulverizing the fossilized this fossilized trackway, that crust that had formed inside that trackway. We had to get rid of it and just, to try to replace it and naturalize that surface. But closer to the road, we had this technique where we didn't break up that surface crust. We didn't overturn the salt crust. We just disrupted it a little bit to disguise that linear scar. So you didn't see a line. You didn't see a track that looked like a 2-track vehicle had approached that area. And that's, to prevent that invitation. And so what you're seeing here is applying that concept of, let's also try not to overturn that existing salt crust. Let's see if we can decompact from underneath those disturbances and keep what we can on the surface. And then, as Lindsay said, the image to the right, we had done that kind of work here, but we were doing it again along the track itself, where to the left we started to learn that we can kind of manipulate the parts in between and on the outside of those trackways to create more of this flowing organic disturbance that from the roadside, hundreds of feet away, doesn't look anything like a trackway. Maybe looks more like a natural flow pattern. So really great work.
Oh yeah, so this
Brings
is
me
just a
back.
quick, right? You just want to get out there. We have a quick video of some exemplary techniques. Don't laugh at how tired we all look. And this kind of gives you an idea of what the texture was that we were working with and how close we are to the road as well. And some broad fork action. And ultimately, our blob plot, that's the technical term for the organic form technique that we came up with, courtesy of Matt.
Blob plot?
Yeah, blob plot.
I don't think I came up with that name. I love it though. I think it works.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit more on the blob plots?
Yeah, so one of the other things that we were doing with the first disturbance was, after raking out the tracks, applying a water treatment. So watering the surface to stabilize that surface and start to reestablish that salt crust surface. But again, we were watering along that line of disturbance only. So one of the things we did with the blob plots is to water not just the disturbed area, but spread that out while we were watering, and water a larger area. So then areas that we didn't necessarily disrupt with any hand tool, we were helping to kind of disguise and blend into the surrounding surface and make that look a little more natural as well.
And this is kind of an aerial visual of our first blob plot.
Very artsy.
And you can see in the foreground, there's kind of already a shadowed runoff area. And so we tried to be restoration artists as much as possible and blend that into our runoff as well. Try to camouflage it as much as possible.
Yeah.
And
There's
you
a
can
good
see
apropos question, sorry,
what's up.
that you can probably mix in. How are we getting that water here?
I was just about to answer
Okay.
that. You can see a very, very tiny length of hose in between the three people that are there in that photo. I'll go back one. Turns out fire hose is really, really heavy when it's full of water. And we had hundreds of feet of fire hose out. I think our longest stretch of track, we had 900 feet of fire hose out, 2-inch diameter fire hose, correct?
Yeah.
And
Are you
so,
plugging into a fire hydrant or what's going on?
yeah, totally. We were
They're all along the
towing,
road.
yeah, just in case, you know. We were towing out what was it called, a water hog or a water buffalo?
Water buffalo. Yeah. So
Yeah.
we have a water trailer tank that held 400 gallons of water that we would tow to our sites. 400 gallons is not a lot when you start thinking about the area we're working with, and even the length of hose to fill 600, 700, 800 feet of fire hose with water. It doesn't go a long way. So it was quite a process just to even get that hose out there, even to get the water tank out there. That the water treatment process is quite involved. It's one of the main issues of the racetrack and doing restoration out there is that water treatment is required for that kind of work. That's surface to stabilize that surface from any wind erosion. And it's a really long dirt road to get to haul out a water truck. So we also have maintenance has a water truck that is a little harder to get access to at our sites that would hold gallons of thousands of gallons of water as opposed to 400 gallons. But yeah, what we wound up working with was the water tank trailer. For the most part, it was easier to work with, and we figured out we didn't necessarily need a water truck available every single day we were working out there. We could do our disturbance work, our raking, and decompaction work, and then we could go out and water when we at the end of the week as sort of like a break from the harder manual work. But even just rolling up those hoses was plenty of manual work in and of itself. Thanks to law enforcement for providing those fire hoses for us to make it possible.
And just as an example, this particular blob plot, say that 10 times fast, took 3 or 4 different water tanks to complete. So it was many back and forth trips with the water buffalo. So we didn't always work in the same location, depending on where there was approval to work, and kind of the weather conditions too. If it was really, really windy, or if it was going to be raining, we didn't want to be working on the salt flats because if you step on the mud, you're just going to create more track. So this is our second work location, which, as you can see, is totally different texture, totally different materials. And we had to do some quick thinking on our feet and adapt our techniques to what we had available. And so in this big graphic in the right-hand corner, you can kind of see that it's more rocky and sandy here. And when cars drive out onto this section, they sink all of the bigger rocks down into the sandy soil beneath, and that creates a lack of shadow contrast, and that's what makes the tracks kind of stand out. So we had to figure out how to come up from below and push those rocks back up to the surface, which we didn't do. But we tried to emulate it as much as possible. Matt, if you want to elaborate.
Yeah, so the desert pavement is what we're seeing here. contrasting from the salt playa that we were working with on Badwater Road. So this is Mud Canyon area, our second project area. With the desert pavement, you have these larger clasts, the gravel at the surface, that natural processes, wind, will mobilize the finer material. And so what you're left with is this textured surface of larger clasts. And that's the surface alluvium. Beneath that, you have some old lacustrine deposits, so old lake sediments underneath there. And what's happening when people are driving off road here is that, as Lindsay was saying, they're pushing those larger clasts down into the soils below, creating this uniform surface that is highly contrasts with the surrounding surface. And this graphic shows you the shadowing that the textured surface can provide that is not existing along the line of disturbance. And so there's this highly contrasted visual along these disturbances. What we tend to do here, manipulating some of that soil and exposing any of the underneath soil, that was again highly contrasted in color, and was also visually not super effective in disguising a track. And so our method was to minimally move some of these adjacent larger clasts, whatever would roll with ease, using really brooms on the landscape, to just retexturize that surface as best we could. And when you step back from locally, when you're working and raking, you might not necessarily, or brushing out these clasts onto the landscape, it might not look very effective. But when you step back to the roadside, these tracks can basically disappear. And our intention there was just that. Some of that compaction, obviously, we didn't address, and hopefully with time that will fix itself. But the idea is to remove that visual line so it's not an invitation, so more people are further compacting that same area.
Just some pictures of what Matt was just describing, with literally brooming the desert. And we did end up borrowing some seed pans from the veg team so that we could sift out some sand and larger rocks and try to kind of birdseed the larger rocks onto the track, make it look as natural as possible. And I think I have another video here of brooming the desert. Doesn't look like much, but
yeah. And Lindsay and Matt, just a time check, we're at 55 minutes in, so
okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Oh.
All right, so those were
the good part.
Yeah, those were most of our techniques and kind of the evolution of the learning curve that we went through. But here is the result. You can see kind of our first attempts at blob plotting, and how eventually it does just kind of camouflage in with the texture of the surrounding area. Or at least
Also, sorry, Lindsay. Yeah, also to point out that our methods allowed us to work much quicker, much more efficiently with our time to cover more trackways. And that was also a goal, was to, we realized we weren't going to fix these things 100% with our efforts. And so that first track that we had shown in the playa, the original one we had walked through, that wasn't bad work we had done. It was, and it will help restore that area, but it was very time intensive for our efforts, that we spent like a good week on one disturbance to get to the point where here, we did some of these tracks in a day, really, right? So we were able to hit multiple tracks and disguise them to the best of our abilities with minimal impact on the surface.
just a couple more little examples. And it really does just kind of look like water runoff, which is great.
Yeah.
So not only did we work really, really hard, but we played. Just a fun little collage of the good times had out there. The Friends of the Inyo team was camping out there while doing all of this manual labor, which just added a whole other level of fun.
Good times.
We had a beautiful campfire and went on some video game-esque runs through the canyons there. And down in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see Tess on the water tank. So that's how big 400 gallons of water is. It's really not that much.
You got to get up on it to check how much water's left, because the people
Right,
out on the playa
that's
are
it.
like, how much water we got left? I was like, oh, let me throw my head in the top of this thing and see.
Yeah.
Get on there. Yeah.
And you couldn't just like open a valve and let the water flow. We had a pump running and everything, and it was still just like a little baby trickle that would come out of the hose. We were expecting fire hose style like kickback, and
Yes,
that
and
didn't happen.
blasting. We haven't gotten to the blasting yet.
No.
No.
It was
We
really
obviously do
anticlimactic,
better
really.
water.
It's bad.
Lindsay brings up a great point, though. Everybody who is coming from Friends of Inyo driving out the 2-3 hours drive from
3
Bishop
hours, yeah.
Mhm.
on a Monday, and then back out on a Friday, and then back again the next week, camping every single day, living outside. You know, they were working out in the field, doing manual labor, and then off times it wasn't go back, take a shower and relax. It was, you know, stay dirty and relax as best you can. Dealing with winds, high winds at night made sleeping an issue. So we had exhausted crew workers during the week.
Yeah.
And I don't think we really fought at all. I mean, we had access to multiple sharp tools, and not once did any of us think.
The great thing is it's so easy to find your own personal space when you really need to go cool down. And so you just go walk out to a far track and just start shoving utensils into the ground, and it makes you feel really good, really fast. So
Yeah, you take it out on the land, really.
exactly.
Yeah, I think for some of it, everyone was too exhausted to even have the energy to be angry at one another.
No.
But it was awesome. It was great morale out in the field, great teamwork, making sure we're checking on each other, make sure we're hydrating, making sure we're, addressing any issues, and working together on strategizing on efforts and treatment methods. And it really was a full team effort, and we got a lot of great work done in our national park. So.
And we even had a concert at one point. I think that's the next slide, right?
Oh yeah. So speaking of sleep deprivation, this was the morning after one of the windiest nights that we had out there. Nobody got a minute of sleep. My tent was laying flat on my face all night long. So this is Maggie, and she's a musician. And I'll let that be the explanation. You can hear how windy it is still the next morning, but this is better. We lost our minds.
Yeah, that faint little whistling you could hear, we could hear very well. That was
One of our
hard to pick
greats.
up on the phone, but great to hear in person. And we were getting kind of kooky out there.
That was close to that was at the end of the week there.
Yeah.
This was a Friday. It was
No.
It was time to go home.
Right.
But it was fun. We don't need to see that again. So this is just a graphic of visitation to Death Valley over the years and how it's only going up, and this problem isn't going to be going away anytime soon. Matt, if you want to expand.
Yeah, so in 2019, we had 1.7 million visitors. And if we think about the disturbances on the landscape as invitations for future disturbances, future incursions onto the landscape, the increased visitation, it's going to be a problem that's going to continue to get worse. One of the best treatments for dealing with OHV disturbances is a rapid restoration. It's to clean those tracks up as best we can and efface them as best we can as soon as possible. The current processes that we operate under don't necessarily allow that to happen. And so this graphic kind of shows you that if we have this increased visitation and we have increased access to these disturbances that are going to lead to further, exponential disturbances, it shows you the need to maybe adapt to the changing landscape that we have here with increased visitation. People want to come out to the parks, and that means potential increased damage.
And one of the ways to mitigate that is by prevention too. So not only should we be getting rid of the tracks faster, but prevent them from happening in the first place. So towards the end of our weeks there, we made these signs, hopefully that will inform people, don't drive out onto the playa.
Yeah, our OHV tech, Mark Gatlin, had done some good routing work with our tools in the park to create these classic Park Service signage using just kind of reclaimed wood from around the maintenance yard. And so we had friends of Inyo on some of their downtime or for on a Friday after some hard work during the week, paint the signs for us. And then we created, as you can see on the bottom right, having access to put signage in the ground is an issue with ground disturbance, with that being ground disturbance in order to put those signs in the ground. And so we created this very stable base that allows us to deploy these signs anywhere we've done some restoration. So they had to be really sturdy to prevent them from knocking over in the wind. Again, because they're not in the ground, they sit on top of the ground, but they allow us to sort of get around that ground disturbance issue and still allow us to put some temporary signage out to help prevent any future disturbances in our project areas.
Yeah.
So with that being said, Friends of the Inyo has created a petition to send to Death Valley Superintendent. And that's on our website. And I think that we're going to be sharing the link in the chat box as well.
Put it in the chat there. Yeah. So folks, you can go ahead and click through that. I'm double checking 1 second, making sure that's the right one. But I believe I tried it just a few minutes ago. And yeah, that's a place where you can fill out a form. That'll be a form submission that then we can pass on to the superintendent. So that's a great way to do that. And then you can also, I'll throw another URL in there to support our trail ambassadors, doing the good work that Lindsay and the crew did during the fall and winter out in Death Valley. We also do similar stuff in the summertime on the trails of the Sierra, doing a lot of great work, visitor interaction, trail maintenance. And so a great way to support our programs there is to give through our Q1 appeal that's going on right now. So those are a couple things y'all can check out. And just want to say thank you so much to everybody who came. And we will, we went over a little bit, but with 3 people, I feel like we get extra time running the 3-man weave here. And so, but there are a couple questions that maybe we can answer if folks want to stick around. A couple, namely, that I think, we kind of glossed over, but the impetus of this whole program, and folks are asking a lot about park involvement and long-term kind of monitoring of stuff. So this was all part of a huge grant that came to the park through the California Off-Highway Vehicle Motorized Recreation Division. It's a lot of that green sticker funds that come through OHV, off-highway vehicle registrations. And then, so that came to Death Valley National Park, and then Death Valley National Park contracted through Great Basin and Friends of the Inyo to work on this project. And so, a lot of folks were asking, all that work we're doing to kind of invent this wheel, so to speak, of how to do this work. Matt and Amber, who was mentioned, and the rest of their team there, the Great Basin Institute, are doing amazing, tireless work, photographing, GPS tracking. They're putting together like a book about all the work that we've been doing out there with all the statistics and everything. Friends Inyo was kind of just the grunts that came in to do the good hard work out on the ground without having to think too much. So thank God for them for doing the work. And yeah, some folks asked what the kind of NPS response to this, Matt, and so I wanted to see if you had any notes about that.
A question of the response to
the work we've been doing, and if if the NPS has been pleased with kind of the outcomes of the work we've been doing.
I think as far as our restoration work and our collaboration, that work that we did from October to December was excellent and applauded by the park. But it's a drop in the bucket of as far as work that needs to be done. We cleaned up, we restored 5.7 miles of track between October and December with our work out there. But we have hundreds of miles of disturbances in the park, and many areas that have, over 50 disturbances in each spot. So processing those areas for approval is one of the issues we have with being able to successfully address this problem. And that's due to some of the laws that exist that require full surveys of project areas. OHV is an issue that's sort of an interesting example of how this issue doesn't necessarily fit in the laws. It wasn't necessarily, the laws weren't designed to address our project areas, which are essentially 1,000 feet off the road in each direction on all roads in the park. That's a massive project area, and the current laws for federal work, for federal undertakings, any work that utilizes federal funds requires a full cultural survey in those areas. And so there are times where that doesn't really fit the system, right? It's almost unreasonable or impossible to survey such a large area, to process and get to the point where you can approve sites for restoration. And some of that is due to that potential impact on cultural resources, where we have disturbances and cultural resources hand in hand. But I would add that allowing those processes to continue without being able to rapidly restore is a threat to the cultural resources that those laws are meant to protect, as much as the natural resources that are being impacted. So I think the work we've done was great. I think we have a lot more to do in the park, but I think we're heading in the right direction. And I hope that with Friends of Inyo, we can continue to have some more areas approved for some restoration in the cooler months ahead. It is getting warmer in the park here to the point where field work won't really be an option. So yeah, that's a little disappointing.
Yeah, and a lot of folks had, a lot of folks had questions too about, potentially putting up guardrails or like cameras to catch folks. And can you remind us the acreage of Death Valley National Park, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, over 3 million acres. It's a massive area. It's the size of Connecticut. It's its own little state. And so I guess if you were to think realistically of putting guardrail up over all the potential areas of off-road where you could have off-road incursions, you'd have miles, hundreds and thousands of miles of guardrail. And that's not why people come to a national park, right? You come to experience that natural environment. And that's one of the issues with these disturbances, is that they do, ecological damage with driving off-road. But you also just have that human element, that disturbance that is not natural on the natural landscape that, we as the Park Service, it's our job to protect that land. And removing those tracks is my job. That's why I'm in the park. That's my focus every single day. So every day we're not doing that. I'm continuing to fight for that, making progress in that area.
Yeah. Yeah, great. There was a question about any potential issues with invasive species colonizing the blob plots, maybe where that soil is freshly disturbed. I don't think that soil is very habitable. Would that be?
No, but that is a threat. I mean, it's a threat even just not necessarily our work, but anyone driving off-road to introduce invasive species, weeds and such, into some of those lands. So
yeah,
that is a problem. That is an issue for off-road incursions in general. But it is true that our work disturbs that surface. And there's sort of that trade-off of leaving those scars on the landscape, or actively doing some work to them that might further disturb them in the short term, with the hope that we can let them efface in time and remove themselves from the landscape. But that is a good point.
And there was a question about, and I think this is actually a really smart idea. Could we wear like special shoes that would be less likely for us to create footprints? Might have to look into that. Maybe some like hoverboard shoes or something.
Or like
zip around.
snowshoes to disperse.
Snowshoes, yeah, or like maybe just like a little sneaker with a rake on the back of it that you can just kind of
there we go.
go for a hike on a disturbance and help clean them up for us.
Exactly.
Playa dance party.
That's right.
That's right. We did talk about that.
We've explored some of these options out on the playa in the heat, and they all seemed great at the time.
Yeah.
There's no shortage of good ideas here.
Oh, apparently there's some like shoes that hunters wear, I guess, that are basically just like big soft pads. So we'll have to look into that. We may have found a new way to do it. Sweet. But yeah, and I also want to mention too, Matt mentioned the heat when we were working out there. I think those days we were working from like 5 a.m. to 1 or 2, something like that.
Right.
And then hanging out at the golf course to stay cool the rest of the time. But it was an interesting work environment, but Matt was a great host and made it all very comfortable and worthwhile and super fun. So
and I'm glad that you guys are still talking to me, because the first week you guys were in the park, I had mentioned that the park Death Valley has a pool for the employees, and I had mentioned it as an option to cool off after our field work, only to find out that week that you guys started, we were draining the pool for repairs and you wouldn't have access to the pool. So
yeah,
that was a disappointment.
It was a bad start, that's for sure.
Yeah, we also found that there were like at one of the little resorts, once that reopened, there were these areas that had like the misters at the top, and so we would just stand outside under those for a while. While all the nice tourists went and went to their rooms, we were just gross and standing under the misters. So, but I don't think there are any more questions coming in. A little plug too, folks. We do have a blog post up on our website about all of this work we did. And then I also put together a piece for our Jeffrey Pine Journal that's coming out in April. It's off to the printer just now, so keep an eye out for that. A nice little write-up of the work that we did out with Matt, and hopefully get to do a lot more here in the future. So thank you all for coming, and we had a great time, and we'll have a follow-up email with some more information as well as those links again, if you'd like to write a form or what have you. Yeah, thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, guys.